Welcome to the John H. Ames reading series, and especially welcome back to Bennett Martin. We're glad to be back in this building after being closed for 2.5 months. This evening we have with us John McNamara, a resident of Omaha. He's a freelance writer who received a B.S. in journalism from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He is the public relations officer for the Nebraska Arts Council. John has had his works published in Omaha Magazine, Old Hickory Review, Cross Currents, Piedmont Literary Review, and Flatwater Arts Companion. He is currently working on a novel entitled Madonna, and I believe this evening he will read from some short stories. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you. I don't think I'm going to need this. Nice to see so many familiar faces. The first short story I'm going to read tonight is from a series I've been doing which uses the same first-person narrator who goes unnamed. And there are about 5 or 6 stories in the series now. I forget chronologically where this fits in. They haven't been written chronologically. They were during a period around the Vietnam War. And I believe this is one of the earlier ones. It's called Piecework. By all rights, we both should have been killed, weaving in and out of Memphis morning rush hour traffic, thousands of irritable motorists roaring along at 75 interstate miles an hour, destined for jobs most of them could not care about less if they tried. Charlie and I were speeding toward President's Island, which was not really an island anymore, for a causeway built years ago diverted the Mississippi from its former channel. The river now enveloped Mud Island, churned into a wide western curve, then flowed nearly due north until it swept southwest again around President's Island. I suppose it could have been renamed President's Peninsula, but things were slow to change in the South, and even though I was a transplanted Yankee with limited Confederate experience, I had lived in Tennessee long enough to recognize the patterns of Southern behavior, even if I did not comprehend them. Charlie and I worked at the Iverson Furniture Company. Her full name was Charlene. Charlie was a nickname pinned on her by her father for reasons she would never fully explain, but which I could guess. No doubt he had hoped to sire a tight end or a linebacker instead of a secretary to a personnel manager. Charlie got me the job on the assembly line that winter just before I went into the Air Force. In fact, I had already enlisted in a delayed entry program. I would be home for the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, then off to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio for basic training. Charlie was blonde with vibrant blue eyes which still promised a measure of innocence, and considered her position within the 2-person personnel department one of status. I was 19 by a week and a half and would soon be off to war. My job at Iverson was temporary and everyone knew it, making allowances for my exuberance. I side-glanced at her as we exited Interstate 55 and filed into line behind the other autos waiting to make a left turn onto the causeway. The only thing which prevented Charlie from becoming truly beautiful was her glasses. They were bulky and unflattering, with plain black frames and those traditional lenses that were shaped like television screens. She looked at me and smiled, and I forgave her those eyesores, for even they could not detract from her beguiling vitality. Charlie had been granted a reserved parking space near the plant entrance, for her duties often required her to leave during working hours, ferrying papers for her boss here and there. I swung her 1965 Ford Fairlane 500 into her designated slot and killed the engine. We were early again. My recklessness in propelling us to work each morning and home again each evening shaved minutes off the time it would take a sane individual. "It's Friday again," I said. "Want to do something tonight?" "I don't know," Charlie said. "Maybe. We could go to a movie, dinner." I removed the keys from the ignition and passed them to her. She dropped them into a snapping pocket of her perch. Ask me again at lunch," she said. Charlie was hopelessly infatuated with her boss, Bobby Breechlaw, and I was hopelessly infatuated with Charlie. Besides her glasses, the only other thing that kept Charlie from being perfect was her nagging lack of self-worth. She seemed unaware of her own beauty, poise, and intelligence. She could tell a good joke and knew how to laugh at one as well, and somewhere during her 24 years she had lost her accent, which only endeared her to me even more. Bobby was married, but I suspected that Charlie harbored a secret belief that one day he would jolt to his senses, abandon his wife and 2 children, and seek comfort and happiness in her arms. I knew she would waste the morning dropping unsubtle hints that she was free tonight, but that each would be impersonally rebuffed by Bobby, and at lunch Charlie would agree to go out with me, even though she considered it slumming. She was from some nondescript town in central Tennessee, did not know many people in the city, and reluctantly enjoyed the attention I and my friends showered upon her. The 5 years difference in our ages was significant, and for such an alluring woman to appear in the company of a sophomore college dropout proved to be a heady intoxicant. What Charlie lacked in self-confidence, I more than compensated for with my overinflated self-image. At precisely 8 o'clock, I waved across my waist-high work table to Elijah, a tall, sinewy black man in his late 50s, and the unofficially recognized crew foreman. The sanctioned foreman, Ollie Godwin, had secured his job in much the same manner as I, only he utilized family ties rather than friendship. Ollie reluctantly bowed to Elijah's experience in most matters, seemingly content to shoulder the vacuum of his authority and pocket his paycheck each week, relatively free of the burdens of responsibility, while enjoying all its benefits. Ollie wore a shirt and tie. Elijah wore overalls and a blue bandana bound about his graying hair. Elijah waved back at me. He had shuffled me under his wing at Iverson, instructing me in the proper manner in which to fit the steel springs into their brackets, how to staple the brackets to the wooden chair and sofa frames with our pneumatic guns, then how to wire the springs together with reinforcing clips so they would not bend independently of one another. Elijah also warned me not to match quarters with Clarence Washington for pop during breaks, for Clarence was an artfully supreme hustler. I tested the blast of my staple gun, aiming at a chair frame 10 feet away. An inch-long staple shot out with the report of a rifle, then embedded a half an inch into the white pine. I smiled, hefting the tool in my hand, and practiced some fast draws from the hip, but the rubber air hose snagged on my elbow and I felt foolish untangling it. Elijah chuckled, pulling the frame of a sofa bed onto his table. He tackled the more demanding jobs, sofa beds, wing-back chairs, while I concentrated on straightforward, unadorned armchairs. Each frame had a sheet of gum stickers attached to it like trading stamps, identifying the particular item and how much time each phase of assembly should last. Each worker along the line removed the stamp appropriate to his or her segment of the operation. Quality control continually evaluated the manufacturing process for every model at Iverson, determining the optimum times for each stage. The sofa bed Elijah began that morning should have taken 66 minutes for an average worker to fit with springs, because of the installation of the bedding apparatus. The chair I pulled onto my work table had been rated at 18 minutes. Piecework. Every employee clocked in at 8 and clocked out at 4:30, but time on the job did not determine how much each was paid. At the end of the week, the gummed stickers, which each worker pasted to his timesheet, were tabulated, and the total number of minutes represented that week's wage base. Elijah physically was on the premises for 40 hours each week, but with his speed and dexterity, he accumulated anywhere from 60 to 75 hours of stickers in that period. Everything in excess of 40 hours was paid time and a half. Elijah's weekly paycheck was usually fatter than Ollie Godwin's. Because I was temporary help aiding in the seasonal rush, I was paid a strict hourly wage, no piecework. But I still pulled stickers for inventory control. I liked Elijah. He was a kind, honest, and forthright man with no illusions. I had met one of his daughters who picked him up outside the factory each evening. She attended Memphis State University, majoring in marketing, and Elijah often spoke of his admiration for the girl. I knew there were other children at home. It might simply have been the flavor of the time or my naivete, but I prided myself for considering this black man my friend, and maintaining his approval became important to me. Ollie knew I was slow, even on the simpler pieces, but my efforts freed Elijah and the other spring installers for the more demanding tasks. Because not much was expected of me, I sometimes slipped Elijah the gum stickers from part of my work. He accepted them with his usual smile, which deepened the creases around his eyes and stretched taut the skin over his cheeks. Christmas was but days away, and he could use the extra minutes of work credit. I assured myself I was not buying Elijah's gratitude, that the kinship I felt toward him was genuine. But I also admitted to a sense of self-satisfaction, congratulating myself for flaunting the besieged convention that had segregated blacks and whites in the South. At noon, over a pork tenderloin on a soggy bun, Charlie agreed to go out with me that night. She possessed the ability to transform her acceptance of my earlier invitation into a condescension for which I was obligated to display overt gratitude. I never wanted to disappoint Charlie, so I fawned over her at lunch, scurrying to the vending machine when she wanted another pint of skim milk with her sandwich. Later, back on the line, Clarence ribbed me about being whipped, but I said someone with Charlie's looks could keep me whipped for as long as she liked. Clarence soon fell silent. The only sound from his work table was the whoosh slam of his staple gun. I slashed the fare lane through rush hour traffic like a frightened rodent, swerving in front of other cars, switching lanes at will in what must have appeared as random selection. But as I skidded against the curb in front of Charlie's apartment building, I glanced at the dashboard clock and smiled, knowing I had arrived at least 3 minutes earlier than if I had kowtowed to everyone else's pace. She got out and told me to pick her up at 7. Charlie often allowed me the use of her car, which I naturally interpreted as evidence that she felt more for me than the platonic friendship she claimed. We saw Camelot again that night, Charlie's current favorite film, ate pizza, and then returned to her apartment, a studio with a tiny kitchenette concealed behind folding, louvered doors. She handed me a bottle of wine and I unscrewed the cap, pouring a measure in a tumbler for her and then some for myself. It was bubbly, fruity, and cheap, but neither of us minded or could afford better. We drank for effect and not for sophistication. Then Charlie cradled her glass in both hands and eased herself down onto her Iverson recliner, upholstered in avocado naugahyde. I remembered one summer evening when her sweaty skin had adhered to the material and she literally peeled herself from the chair. Now she leaned back and extended the footrest as the padded head cushion sank toward the wall. She kicked off her penny loafers and crossed her legs at the ankles. Charlie had to tilt her head forward to drink her wine without spilling it. "Are you scared?" she asked. Probing my reaction to going off to war had lately become Charlie's favorite avocation, and the speculation consumed many of our conversations. She explained her curiosity by asking me if I was interested in the experience of childbirth. I said I supposed I was, but not in the way at which she wanted to know about war. And what did the two have to do with one another anyway? Because I was a man, she tediously explained, I could sympathize with the agony of childbirth, but never fully understand it. And because she was a woman, she would never fully understand the horror of war. But she wanted to try. I once told her I would gladly help her have a child if she would accompany me to war, at which she laughed mischievously. But I never intended really to go to war. I had every confidence the Air Force in its wisdom would station me in Europe, perhaps Germany, where when I was not repairing jet engines or controlling air traffic, I would spend my leave time leisurely photographing majestic castles perched on forested bluffs overlooking the Rhine. "They say you're stupid if you're not scared at least a little bit," I answered her. "I'd be scared," she said firmly, then sipped from her wine. "I think that's a healthy attitude. Why don't you open the sofa bed?" The recliner was the only chair in the room, and Charlie said she preferred having the bed opened, to give the studio apartment a feeling of greater coziness. In truth, with the bed open, there was little space in which to navigate about the room. "All right," I said, setting my wine glass on the table beside Charlie, and turning to stack sofa cushions on the floor beside the kitchen doors. The bed sheets were fresh, and the smell they exuded revitalized my long-standing prayer that Charlie and I might conclude an evening embraced beneath that yellow percale. But the unfulfilling routine never seemed to vary. Charlie remained stretched out on the recliner, and I tossed off my shoes and laid down on the open bed. The wine and relaxing positions fueled the discussion. "I can't imagine anyone wanting to kill me," she continued. "Neither can I." "But you might find yourself in that situation," she said. "Yeah," I admitted with a sigh, pleased to emphasize any sense of danger in which Charlie wished to imagine me. "I just might." "It must be awful." "Don't worry about me," I advised. "I can take care of myself." "You'll write?" "Sure I will." "Bobby says he won't need you next week," Charlie said, sliding so smoothly away from the net of sympathy in which I was trying to ensnare her that for a moment I did not register what she had said. "Did you hear me?" she asked, tilting her head forward both to stare at me and sip from her wine. "I'm fired, huh?" "Let go, really. You knew it was temporary, and Ollie said he doesn't need you anymore because they've caught up on the line." I nodded, then gulped the rest of my wine. "And Bobby said you might appreciate the time off to say goodbye to your friends and have a little fun. Bobby was in the Army, you know." "Uh-huh." You can have my car during the day if you want. Just drive me in the morning and pick me up in the afternoon. What if you have to go out? I'll just take Bobby's car. He's got a Mustang. Well, okay, thanks. More wine, she said, and I scuttled across the sheets and poured more into her tumbler. Then I refilled mine. Oh, and I've got your last paycheck in my purse. Monday morning when I dropped Charlie off in the Iverson parking lot, I watched in the rearview mirror as Elijah's daughter pulled to a halt behind me and kissed her father goodbye. Elijah stopped by the car and said hello to me, leaning in the passenger window and eliciting my promise that I would stop and say goodbye before I left for San Antonio. I spent my day with Leon Dubonnet, who skipped his classes at Memphis State and drove with me to Walls, Mississippi on Highway 61, where we enjoyed the 19-year-old drinking age in a roadside tavern. We played shuffleboard, pool, pinball, and bowling on a tabletop machine that used chrome pucks instead of balls. And I bragged incessantly to Leon about my mythical conquest of Charlie. Everyone in my circle of friends assumed that since we were spending so much time together, I must be sleeping with her. None of us believed in patience or maintaining women merely as friends. Shortly after 4:30, I lounged behind the wheel of the Fairlane in the parking lot waiting for Charlie. Clarence Washington sauntered by without saying hello, as did a few of the women from the upholstery department. I had the radio playing loudly, and in my easy drunkenness did not notice immediately that no one returned my waves of greeting. I did not see Elijah's daughter. Finally, Charlie emerged from the building and approached the car. I asked her to drive. Charlie plodded along with the bulk of the traffic, and I said nothing, comfortable with the radio as accompaniment to my thoughts. She said nothing, and I assumed she too was enjoying the music, which was still playing loudly. But as I watched her, I noticed the tension evident in the clenched set of her jaw, and she stared at the road, rarely blinking. "What's the matter?" I asked over the music. "It was a lousy day," she answered, turning down the volume. "Anything in particular happen, or was it just another Monday at the office?" Charlie turned to view me, and the expression in her eyes was one I had never seen before. "What did I say?" I asked hurriedly, suddenly frightened that something I had done had provoked the hatred I saw in her look. "Ollie Godwin reported Elijah this morning, said he had stolen some of your time stickers. They would have fired him, but he's been there so many years, so they suspended him for 3 weeks without pay." "I gave him those stickers," I protested. "Everyone knows that." "Well then, he's colored," Charlie interrupted. "What the hell difference? It makes all the difference," she cut me off again. "Did you see him? Did you talk to him?" "No. They sent him home after they told him." Damn. I considered calling Elijah to say that I would speak to someone, do something, but I knew it would make no difference, would not undo what was already done. "Damn," I repeated. "Yeah." Charlie drove to her apartment, then got out and left the motor running. "Why don't you change, then pick up some burgers and come back," she said. "I don't feel like being alone tonight." She frowned and hurried toward the door without allowing me a chance to answer her. I would not have said no, and not having the opportunity did not bother me either. I enjoyed killing time with Charlie, for every moment spent in her presence increased the odds that I might get as close to her as I wished. When I returned later, Charlie unlocked her door, a glass of unwatered bourbon in her hand. She wore her terry cloth housecoat, and I glimpsed her slit beneath it as she cinched the belt tighter. The sofa bed was open and the sheets tossed back haphazardly. She ordinarily was such a fastidious woman. The disorder of the room surprised me. Her wrinkled dress lay draped over the back of the recliner, her shoes dropped on the floor beside the chair. The nearly full bourbon bottle rested on the tiny kitchen counter beside the single sink, its cap removed. "Did you make mine a cheeseburger?" she asked, leaving me to shut the door. "Just the way you like it," I answered, "heavy on the mustard." "Good, I'm hungry." Charlie upended her French fries on the flattened paper bag and placed it on the corner of the mattress. She perched on the edge of the recliner and dipped each fry in ketchup, then rushed it to her mouth to avoid dripping anything on the sheets. She barely chewed her food, gulping down chunks of her cheeseburger like a zoo animal. I shared her disgust over what had happened to Elijah, but I felt slighted that she would not allow me the greater anger. I felt robbed. I considered myself a better friend of Elijah than she, yet Charlie appeared genuinely incensed. Half my food remained uneaten when she balled the wrappings from her meal and toted them to the kitchen. She threw them violently into her garbage can. More bourbon sloshed into her empty glass. Then Charlie returned to the bed and laid down. Her housecoat fell open, revealing her thighs. She made no move to cover them. I stared unabashedly at her legs, the skin unblemished. For the first time, I seemed to understand the use of the word creamy in describing those limbs. "Do you want to go out?" I asked. Some warped precept demanded that I offer Charlie what I did not want her to take. Or perhaps it was my own fear of attaining the fulfillment of a dream which drove me to pose the invitation I did not want her to accept. I swore I lost all sensation for a moment in my feet when Charlie shook her head and swallowed more bourbon. "No," she said, folding her arms across her chest and swirling the liquor in her glass. "You want to watch TV?" "No." I had not the courage to ask Charlie what I desperately wanted to ask her, but I did not want to suggest every possible alternative until from sheer process of elimination she beckoned me to her bed. "What do you want to do?" I said, dredging from my dwindling reserves what I prayed with sufficient tenacity to gaze directly into her eyes with an unwavering, overconfident stare. "Nothing," she said, and at the same instant that my fantasy shattered, Charlie patted the mattress beside her with the palm of her hand. "Kick off your shoes and slide up here." Hours later, as the sweat evaporated from our bodies and produced involuntary shivers, she turned to me and nestled her face into the hollow of my shoulder. "Bobby Breechlaw's goddamn wife is pregnant," she whispered. Then fatigue eased her into sleep. I was too stunned to close my eyes and too grateful to resent being used. After that night, Charlie and I became inseparable. I retained the use of her car during the day, so long as I maintained a high profile of loving affection whenever I picked her up or dropped her off at Iverson Furniture. My nightly rewards, when Charlie willingly removed her glasses, more than assuaged my chafed pride. Her energetic acrobatics softened the sting that I was merely a tool of revenge on Bobby Breechlaw. I knew it, but I did not mind. Christmas passed, and Charlie and I greeted the new year in the same fashion in which we moaned farewell to the old. It was but a matter of days before I was scheduled to leave for San Antonio in the Air Force. The Monday when Elijah reported back to work, I waited in the parking lot after dropping off Charlie, watching for his car. I saw it enter and slowly turn into a parking space at the far end of the lot. Elijah emerged and began walking toward the factory entrance, acknowledging morning greetings from some of the other workers. As he approached the fare lane, I opened the door and stepped out. If he saw me, he gave no indication, but when he drew abreast of me, he stopped. "Elijah," I said, my prepared apology suddenly vanishing from memory, "I never wanted to get you into trouble. Hell, I'm sorry." Elijah's dark eyes peered down at me, then the tiny lines in the corners etched deeper, and he wanly smiled. I know. He extended his large hand, the skin tight as old leather. "You take care of yourself. Don't grow too old too fast." I shook his hand as Clarence Washington appeared and tapped him on the shoulder. "Time to get to work, Elijah," he said, and Elijah turned and walked away, but when he had paced but a few feet from the car, and I had opened the door to sit back behind the wheel, I heard him say, "White folks ain't nothing but trouble, Clarence, nothing but trouble." Then he snorted a halting, exasperated laugh. That evening I sighted the rust spot on the Fairlane's hood on the bumper of the Pontiac in front of me, and followed it in the slow lane for what seemed like miles. I told Charlie I could not see her that night, that I thought I ought to spend some time with my family before I left. She nodded wordlessly, and her dispassionate acceptance succeeded in wounding me where her earlier manipulation of my emotions had failed. My chest ached with the effort of stifling the compulsion to weep. I fidgeted in a window seat days later on the airplane as it roared down the runway, lifted into the sky and banked into a wide turn, gaining altitude, affording me an aerial perspective of Memphis. I freed the breath I had captured in my lungs, feeling in my own way released from fragile tethers. And as the landing gear ground back into its housing with a rumbling like rolling thunder, I yearned to feel older in spite of Elijah's admonition. But I did not. I felt young and raw and surprised that the intolerable weight of my reaffirmed innocence had not prevented the plane from taking off. I remember now that that's the first story chronologically in the series. The next one was a story I had published in a magazine, I believe, called Running World or something in Houston, Texas, which drove my parents crazy because they were living there at the time. They still live there, and they went out and bought, I think, every extra copy that was available on any newsstand they could find. It's called Runner. The pounding of his feet on the pavement, of his breath in his chest, of blood in his temples. The pounding. Trees and parked cars smear by as peripheral streaks of color. Sound volleys thunderously, a cacophony of street noise. His eyes fix on the Hawthorne building, tiers of copper-colored glass panes. 7 blocks to the corner, twice around the Hawthorne. 3.5 miles back to the apartment, the pounding of air in and out of his lungs, of the ache in his calves with each pace. Red light, don't walk. Marking time, knees up, drip sweat. Green light, don't walk, stride out. Marcy, he thinks, is fat and soft, not a runner. Marcy lopes, content to accept inertia rather than determine it. She does not lead. Gresham Park on the left, green slopes, not for running. Grass yields, concrete responds. Run the streets, solid and disciplined. Marcy knows nothing of discipline, he thinks. She does not plan. She lacks forethought. Sunlight reflected off the hawthorn bronzes his body. Sweat blurs his vision, whipped by the wind he creates against his face. He wipes his eyes and circles the final corner of the hawthorn. Wave to the newsboy at the stand across the street. Never has Marcy tested her limits. She does not realize she is limited because she has never tried her will. I love her, he thinks, but we are different people than before, existing at different speeds. He races over cloud shadows dappling the sidewalk. Another runner approaches head-on 2 blocks away. A young woman, red satin shorts and a white shirt, blue headband around her brown hair. She is frowning, he notices, yet she is not straining herself. Her thighs are not lean. She has bad wind, he believes, as she draws closer. Her shirt is dry and she smiles as she passes him. That could have been Marcy, he imagines, but she will not even consider the run. She reads paperbacks while she reclines in the shade of the apartment balcony. I exercise my mind, he hears her repeating, while your body wastes, he counters. No cramps, 2 miles to go and no cramps. Slight discomfort in the lower back and a twinge behind the left knee. But good wind, strong will, easy distance and fine time. Run for time, not for distance. Just run for 15 minutes with me, he has asked Marcy. Don't worry about how far we'll go, just for 15 minutes. She steadfastly refuses. He repeatedly admonishes her. We bicker, he thinks, but we coexist and we share. Next block is Shopper's Alley, detour to the street, asphalt of a texture more submissive than concrete. Danger's not so much from traffic as drivers opening doors of parked cars. A rainbow of roll-down awnings on his left, painted window signs, browsing walkers. A police siren wails through a side street and echoes as in a tunnel. A city bus shoulders the curb, heated exhaust plumes around him as he passes. Noxious fumes, he thinks, rising high to the balcony, slowly staining the pages of Marcy's books. The pounding, of urgency in his bowels, of heat behind his eyes, of his elbows chafing his sides. His growing contempt for Marcy, though now mild, he admits troubles him. Growth along parallel lines. But everyone knows parallel lines never meet, not even on the horizon. He worries, but not gravely, not with excessive concern. Final mile, then check the pulse rate and walk, home to Marcy, to the apartment. Pull open the drapes to scare away the dim mood of the living room, shower under the hot water and steam relief into the tense muscles. Marcy, he is sure, could learn to enjoy the effort, the race. A race not against time or distance, but against self. Ability versus faith. Frail endurance versus stalwart fatigue. Sprint the last block, sidewalk cracks slide beneath his feet, his muscles scream, the poundings throb like a drum staccato. Then he stutters to a walk, hikes his hands on his hips and heaves for cool air. He bends forward and sweat drops to the pavement. Half-mile walk, he thinks, then up the stairs to the apartment. Spare those on the elevator the taint of his pungency. Everyone except Marcy. He smiles, more grimaces really, as he stretches to expand his lungs and fill them with air. Marcy deserves the full brunt of his odor. She warrants a tight embrace and a residue of slickness as he will pivot from her and trot to the bathroom. She will make a face and utter a sound of disgust, then orange juice in a chilled glass waiting for him as he emerges from the shower. The apartment building rises before him and he rings his apartment from the lobby. There is a pause and then a buzzer drones. He pushes open the inner door and crosses to the stairwell. Perhaps I should haul Marcy into the shower with me, he muses, soap her down, then rinse her, and dry her with a bath towel, carry her swaddled to the balcony. The pounding, of his footsteps in the tall stairwell, of his heart slowing in his chest, of his growing expectation of confronting Marcy, the pounding. He halts on the landing beside the door which leads to his hallway, and once again checks his pulse rate. He smiles and opens the door. The carpet is another texture unsuitable for running. The next is another short story. It's entitled Cathedral, and probably comes out of my Irish Catholic upbringing and the roots of that. I decided not to be a Catholic when I realized that taking advice about sex from people who decided not to practice it was a little illogical. You're a tough crowd. Cathedral. My father was baptized in the old cathedral, received his first communion in the old cathedral, was confirmed in the old cathedral, and married my mother in the old cathedral. But today we celebrate his funeral in the new cathedral. Nothing lasts forever. My father disliked the new cathedral with its polished wooden walls and high square windows. Churches, he always said, should be built on and of stone. Dark corners and stained glass windows, a haven where prayers would resound as in a cave. They should smell as old as religion and make anyone who enters feel just a bit afraid, for God was someone to fear. My father was a pious man. He loved my mother and all her children. Before his illness, he attended Mass daily and visited his mother every other weekend except during Lent. It was never quite clear who gave up whom during that season. His casket is gleaming blue metal, lined with cream-colored satin, and his gray-haired head rests on an elegant pillow such as was never seen on his bed. The gray suit he wore on Sundays has been pressed, and a tiny rosebud, which my sisters and I bought at the florist's shop yesterday, is pinned to his lapel. Father never cared for flowers, although at Easter he was the first to place a spray of lilies beside the altar before services. I do not believe he ever became comfortable watching the priest facing him during Mass. He was a backwatcher, more calm being led than being confronted. I could never be content with that position, and our disagreement on this point and other progressive changes spanned more than a decade and a half. Our periodic arguments focused on ritualistic rather than theologic points. To my father, the trappings were as important, if not more so, than the philosophy of his faith. God should not be as accessible as a civil servant, he professed. Mystery nurtured the faithful and disciplined them as a force for righteousness. His notions seemed archaic and served to cement the schism which had developed between us. When I abandoned my engineering studies and entered the seminary in the early 1960s, my father's initial reaction was exhilaration. He gladly relegated his desire for grandchildren to my younger sisters and lauded my vocation as a dream come true, the dream of every Catholic parent to have a priest in the family. I suppose my father's support during those years which culminated in my ordination represented his personal hope that I would single-handedly lead the wayward reformers back into the fold, would re-inject Latin into the Mass and restore that act to its former stature, would once again shroud Catholicism in a cloak of indecipherable mysticism. He set himself up for the fall. The bishop reassigned me to my home parish when my father's cancer was detected. Over dinner the first night home, this frail man quite obviously struggled with a dilemma. His adherence to tradition compelled him to decry what he perceived as the erosion of the church, yet his instinctive awe of my collar and what it signified restrained him. He opted for a compromise, securing from me a vow that I would celebrate a Requiem High Mass at his funeral, in Latin, the old way. He was a persevering man. Perhaps our agreement, his victory of sorts, lessened the severity of his pain in these last days. He appeared more at ease than he had in years, knowing he had only to wait to relive the past. The old cathedral has been demolished. The walnut pews and stained glass windows were auctioned off, bought by strangers. And my father lies in state beneath the beams of blonde wood in the new cathedral, as today we celebrate his funeral, his conquest of time. I've got another series of short stories which all deal with the same character named Grayson. And the last story that I'll read tonight is one of the earlier ones from Grayson's series. It's entitled Grayson's Dreams. Along the length of the tree-lined street, the tiny front lawns trimmed at the sidewalks, the grass as green as still swamp water, the women stood at their doorways, some in housecoats, others in skirts and blouses or baggy slacks, shaking their heads, indicating the man had not hidden in their homes. Staring from woman to woman, Grayson sensed his hope sinking and his anger swelling. He turned, his fist clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, and confronted his own house, with the corner porch screened against the summer insects, the wood trim around the windows flaking white paint chips to the driveway, the brick walls rough and fading from the red hue of years before to a dull brown. He advanced up the steps, across the porch and vestibule to the living room, across the carpet and around the settee to the stairs, bounding 2 steps at a stride, pausing at the landing to listen, and hearing no sound whatsoever, walking deliberately down the corridor to the bedroom where his wife lay sleeping upon the mattress. Grayson chose not to wake her. He pivoted from the room and retraced his steps down the corridor to the bathroom, where a foreboding chill beckoned to him from the shower stall. His steps across the narrow room seemed sluggish as he grasped the shower curtain and yanked it back. The man leaped from his crouch, his arms flailing at Grayson. The curtain tangled between the 2 men. The rod tore from its foundation and the walls. They wrestled, the curtain wrapping itself around them both like a blanket. Every rapist deserves to die, Grayson told himself, driving on towards the man's eyes with the fingers of one hand, the other tightening around the man's throat. Grayson hunched his back as the man railed desperate blows on Grayson's back and shoulders. Another dream, a bout of sweating anger, waking with the bed sheet knotted between his legs and his wife, Kate, shying to the far side of the bed, avoiding the arms flung at his imaginary foe. Awareness like a syrup oozed over Grayson's consciousness as he ceased his struggling, bent his legs and pulled them to his chest, circling them with his arms. He tilted forward and rested his forehead, slick and greasy, on his knees. Breathing deeply, he turned his head toward Kate. His wife crouched at the mattress edge, an expression of weary understanding visible in her eyes. Grayson wondered at the depth of her patience. For the past week, the same or similar dreams had plagued his nights, rapists and revenge, until the prospect of sleep conveyed a fear, not of the dream itself, but of its inconclusiveness, of the frustration Grayson experienced from what he regarded as premature awakening. Always in a sweat, always moments before he killed the man. Gray light shone outside the bedroom windows, and the digital clock on the oak table, which Kate had refinished the previous summer, read 6:10. Grayson managed a slight smile for his wife, then rolled his eyeballs upward in their sockets, as though to express again his apology for the disruption of her sleep. The unpredictable accepted as routine was what he realized he had come to expect of her, and Grayson again wondered at the depth of her patience. "Same dream?" Kate asked. Grayson stretched out his legs and laid his head back on the foam rubber pillow, staring at the ceiling, noticing a cobweb threading along the cornice molding. "Just about," he answered his wife. "Think you can get back to sleep?" "I'll give it a try," Grayson said as he untangled the bedsheet and spread it across both him and Kate as she laid down beside him and caressed his chest with her hand. "I love you," she whispered. "I know you do, Kate. I know you do," Grayson whispered in return, the genuineness of the emotion triggering a sudden inhalation. He lay on his back, the royal sleeping position he recalled from some distant memory, particulars of the dream nagging his consciousness, staving off sleep as the gray light beyond the curtained windows brightened with dawn. Beside him, Kate's breathing steadied into the rhythm so familiar it had become a soothing lullaby for him. But its calming effects failed as his eyes refused to remain shut, the lids fluttering open, keeping pace with his concerns. Faint rumblings of early morning traffic from the interstate wafted on a breeze which ballooned the curtains inward from the windows. Birds chattered in the trees and shrubs, and Grayson heard the shower running in his next-door neighbor's bathroom. He had always believed the houses in this old neighborhood had been placed too close to one another. Every month when he wrote out the check for the mortgage payment, he reasoned for such a sum no man should be subjected to the view of his neighbors. How much must he pay for insulation? Insulation from the press of others' problems. Insulation from the plague of his dream. Grayson rolled to his side, a sleeping position for which he could recall no name, if even one existed, and eyed a crack in the wall plaster, tiny and irregular, tracing its fractured path to the windowsill. Another cobweb. Restlessness, whether induced by the dream or Grayson's habitual dissatisfaction with the house, animated his limbs as though some unseen puppeteer had yanked crucial strings. He swung his legs off the bed, rose to a sitting position, and turned to view his wife, Kate. His wife. Kate slept undisturbed as Grayson rose and tiptoed from the room. He strode down the corridor to the spare bedroom at the rear of the house, where he sat on a walnut chair before the desk, another piece Kate had stripped and refinished that summer. He held in his hands the contracts which had been delivered by special messenger the week before. A San Francisco firm, financed with Japanese capital, sought to franchise Kate's shop. A generous cash settlement for the rights to the shop name and concept, in addition to Kate's appointment as a vice president, would erase Grayson's money worries for the rest of their lives. Yet Kate permitted the contracts to age on the desk, Grayson's and her secure future lacking merely her signature upon the copies. Just a slight scratch of the pen, Grayson thought, and every headache associated with the shop and its operation vanishes. Someone in San Francisco earns the ulcers. At the end of the block, a garbage truck into the alley behind the row of houses, its diesel engine complaining with a rumble as it wheezed to a halt and discharged its driver. Grayson gazed out the window with a vacant stare, his mind visualizing the pleasant, neighborless view from their new home, a vista of towering evergreens and lush meadows sloping toward the sea, or perhaps a mountain lake as clear and brilliantly blue as a cornflower. His dream world in which he might be free of dreams. The placidity of Grayson's fantasy shattered beneath the sudden awareness that he had not put out the garbage cans, the box of rags, and empty paint cans the night before. The truck ground its way down the alley toward the house, and Grayson raced to the bedroom, where he speedily donned a pair of jeans, slipped his feet into thong sandals, and sped down the 2 flights of stairs to the basement. The box was cumbersome because of its bulk and not from any great weight. A carton in which books had been shipped to the shop, now piled high with empty paint cans and rags starched with dried paint. Grayson's nostrils prickled at the smell of the kitchen, the unmarred walls a pale green, the odor of paint not as heady as last night, but still forceful. He balanced the box on his hip and swung open the back door, unlocked the screen door, then angled through the doorway, pushing against the screen with a corner of the box. The door ripped with a sound like an old man clearing his throat, and the frame closed against Grayson. A section of the screen folded around the box like wrapping paper. Grayson cursed under his breath and pushed against the door frame, sidling outside with the box edge cutting into his thigh. If it's not one thing with this house, it's another, he thought. Scuffing through dewy grass, he carried the carton across the yard to the gate in the rear fence. The garbage truck, its exhaust charcoal against the silver sky, idled 3 houses down the alley. A man in grimy overalls and a ruffled shirt with the sleeves cut off disappeared behind the truck, carrying a large gray plastic tub, bulging with Grayson's neighbor's refuse. Leaning over the waist-high plank fence, Grayson lowered the box to the patch of gravel beside his trash cans. He stared at the paint cans and stiffened rags, recalling the argument with Kate over the wisdom of painting the kitchen. Her stubbornness in the matter still rankled him, and when at last fatigue dictated his surrender to her insistence, a new conflict arose with Kate's selection of colors. Grayson could not in all his memories remember a pale green kitchen. Yellow, pink, or white, these were the colors of kitchens. Once in a cousin's home in New Hampshire, he had entered a 2-tone blue kitchen, robin's egg on the walls with navy trim on the cabinets and woodwork. And all her dishes, Pfaltzgraff Yorktown stoneware, blue and white everywhere, but never green, paler than the newest spring leaf, paler than any St. Patrick's Day affectation he could recall. With each brushstroke, Grayson had balked, wondering why Kate's fix-it-up fever burned so intensely, when her signature on the contracts resting on the desk upstairs could hire as many professional painters as she could possibly want, each and every one of them matching colors and hues to swatches of material from the new furniture, new walls in their new home. The diesel engine coughed, and Grayson looked up to see the man halt the garbage truck by the edge of Grayson's property. The man climbed down from the high cab and stared at Grayson, then hefted his tub on his shoulder and walked toward the row of trash cans. Witnessing the man at so close a distance pricked within Grayson's memory a withered notion. That insight could be gleaned from conversation with a working-class man. Somehow, the adage promised, people who labored with their hands divined answers to profound questions of purpose. Why love? Why live? Simple solutions evolved from a simple existence. Grayson recognized the fallacy of such an idealistic supposition, admitting his life at present seemed complex simply because his own aspirations remained outside his grasp. In all honesty, Grayson had relinquished determination of the future to Kate and the franchise contracts. "You got something you want to say to me, mister?" The word shocked Grayson out of his thoughts, and he raised his head to confront the man. What Grayson had assumed was the man's hair now revealed itself as a black kerchief bound around his head and knotted at the back of the man's neck. Pocketing his hands and stepping back from the fence, Grayson shook his head. No, just getting some air, that's all." The man eyed Grayson, then lifted the box of paint cans and rags and tossed it into his plastic tub. "Lots better air somewhere else than garbage cans." Grayson nodded and turned back toward the house, the sun tinting the eastern sky with an orange haze. Scarcely 9 hours earlier, Grayson had been at the driving range, caged behind the wheel of an aging Ford tractor, dragging a contraption like an old rotary mower in ever-tightening circles, the blade slapping the yellow golf balls into twin bins. Duffers under the lights of the AstroTurf tees cheered whenever a drive rattled Grayson's wire cage. In the bedroom, Grayson stripped off his jeans and slipped off his sandals, his feet wet from the dew. Kate slept on her side, one arm crooked as a pillow beneath her head, her hair fallen over half her face. Grayson gripped her shoulder and shook her. Kate muttered and twisted away to evade his grasp, but Grayson shook her more firmly. "What is it?" Kate whined as she rolled and propped herself on her elbows, squinting at Grayson seated beside her on the mattress. "Are you awake enough to understand me, Kate?" Grayson said. "It's important that you understand what I have to say to you." Kate nodded her head. "No, you have to answer me. I want to know that you'll remember what I'm going to say." "I'm awake," Kate bristled and sharply sat up. All right, now listen to me." Grayson inhaled deeply. "Those contracts have been sitting on that desk for over a week now. I think that's long enough. You make a decision today. You sign them this morning or you send them back, okay?" Kate said nothing, merely tilted back her head until it softly thumped against the headboard. "I'm serious, Kate. You sign them today or you send them back." Fingering the hem of her nightgown, Kate turned to her husband. "If that's what you want, Grayson, you know what I want." "All right." Grayson leaned over and kissed his wife, then laid down beside her and covered himself with the bedsheet. As the garbage truck in the alley droned in compression of its cargo, tension in the form of a tightening of the muscles at the back of his neck reminded him of the frustration of his incomplete dream. Perhaps this one time, he thought, just this one time, I'll kill him. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Good night.